African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 1. The Mau Mau Revolution. 1. Account for the Mau Mau Uprising of 1952–55. 2. Discuss the causes and effects of the Mau Mau Revolt of 1952. 3. To what extent were the British colonial administrative policies responsible for the Mau Mau Uprising? 4. The colonial administrative policies were primarily responsible for Mau Mau Rebellion of 1952. Discuss. 5. The land question was primarily responsible for the outbreak of Mau Mau Uprising of 1952. Discuss. 6. Assess the response of the British to the Mau Mau Rebellion. 7. Account for the defeat of the Mau Mau Rebellion. 8. To what extent did the Mau Mau Revolt of 1952–55 contribute to political developments in Kenya? 9. How far was the Mau Mau Rebellion nationalistic? The Mau Mau Uprising was an African rebellion against British colonial rule in Kenya. It was fought from 1952–1955. Some of its leaders were Bildad Kagya, Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta General. China, Isaac Athenju, Fred Kibane, Dedan Kimathi, Paul and J. It was organized by the Kenya African Union KAU, ex-servicemen of the World War Roman II and the ANIC were 40 Group of 40. It was mainly led by the Kikuyu but joined by other tribes. Causes of the Mau Mau Rebellion. 1. Massive land alienation caused the Mau Mau Rebellion. The white colonial rulers grabbed land from the Africans and handed it over to the white settlers. 1 million acres, especially of fertile lands in the highlands, were reserved for the white settlers by the Land Commission. This caused a landless group of over 2 million Africans, making them live in overcrowded central province. Africans were pushed into reserves that were not fit for human settlement and production of crops. This caused a rebellion in Kenya. 2. The Kippen system arose out of lack of land. This was instituted as a means of regulating the flow of African labor to the white settler highlands. The Africans were required to move with identity cards for identification, and whoever failed to do so was arrested, imprisoned and subjected to hard work on the land they had lost. They appealed to the colonial authority to abolish the system, but all in vain. They therefore resorted to violence in 1952. 3. Due to loss of land by the Kenyans, the people were compelled to live in reserves created by the whites. The reserves were exclusively congested with the pro-social economic services, which often caused loss of lives. This compelled the Kenyans to join the Mau Mau Uprising. 4. The existence of vacant land in the hand of the white settlers caused the rebellion. Land which had been forcefully owned by the white settlers remained idle, yet Africans were herded together. African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 2 campaigns and were with no time to work on their own plots. They were in most cases unpaid for labor on holidays of chiefs and their well supporters. This was resented by the Africans. 6. African loss of land worsened their poverty levels. They did not have land to fill or seek agricultural employment. This caused and called poverty among the Africans and thus prepared them for a revolt. 7. Absence of land among Africans caused food shortage. The Africans did not have agricultural land and yet did not have alternative sources of food. This worsened misery and hopelessness among the Kenyans, forcing them to resort to the Mau Mau Uprising. 8. The Kenyans were not allowed to grow profitable cash crops such as pyrethrum tea, coffee, sisal because they did not have land. Such crops were reserved for the white settlers who had large chunks of land in fertile areas. The African interpreted this as a deliberate attempt to impoverish them. Therefore the Africans were forced to organize themselves against colonial establishment. 9. Rural-urban migration by the aggrieved peasants resulted from loss of land. The Kenyans who lost land were forced to move to towns where they encountered numerous problems, for example housing shortage, racial discrimination, urban unemployment, among others. African women continued to be arrested as prostitutes. This forced the idle urban dwellers to join the Mau Mau movement. 10. Due to loss of land, Africans were forced to start selling off their cattle. The colonial government argued that Africans did not own enough land to keep large herds of cattle. They said they could end up trespassing on their vacant land. This did not please Africans because it directly impacted on their economic livelihood. 11. The British government forced the Kenyans to carry out soil conservation in the countryside on land which was already too small. It gave orders against cultivation along steep slopes, and this was enforced by using force. The whites also enforced soil conservation in the crowded reserves using terracing. This left the Africans with almost nothing to fill worsening famine and congestion. 12. The landless Africans were exposed to untold unemployment, which grossly angered the Kikuyu. The unemployed became idlers in towns. Tough laws were enacted/made to repatriate anyone who failed to secure permanent employment after 3 months of residence in Nairobi. Other laws empowered police to arrest anyone suspected of being unemployed. This made Kenyans to turn to armed struggle. 13. The landless Kenyans resorted to crime-making for survival. The jobless and landless Kenyans started stealing in order to survive, and many found themselves in prison. This could not be tolerated. 14. The role of land is further emphasized in the Kikuyu hymns, often reminded the Kikuyu to recover the lost land that had been left to them by the Kikuyu and Mamba, the mythical founders of the Kikuyu society. In fact, the Kikuyu believed that the god Ngai would not be happy with them. African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 3. 16. The role played by ex-servicemen caused the Mau Mau Rebellion. The ex-servicemen were facing problems like unemployment, low standards of living than they had enjoyed in the colonial army. They felt that their wartime service was not properly rewarded. Therefore, they joined with elites to turn tables against colonial rule. 17. Discrimination of Kenyans in the economic and political affairs of Kenya caused the Mau Mau Rebellion. The colonialists eliminated Africans from politics and only collaborated with chiefs who became colonial puppets. Even Kenyans who were qualified enough could not secure jobs. Thus, the Africans got determined to eliminate colonial rule by force. 18. Cultural arrogance of the white settlers led to the Mau Mau uprising. They promoted their supremacy over the Africans whom they treated as inferior. They segregated Africans in all aspects they enjoyed social life. In 1950, a prominent white settler said, "We are here to stay and the other races must accept the fact with all that it implies." Therefore, the Africans got convinced that racial arrogancy could only be stopped with a revolt. 19. Overtaxation of the Kenyans gave birth to Mau Mau Rebellion. Despite stinging poverty among Africans, the Kenyans were made to pay exorbitant taxes that were coupled with harsh means of collection. The taxes paid were used to provide social services basically in areas of the white settlers. This was seen as an exploitation of man by man, leading to the armed rebellion. 20. The colonial policy of limiting the African representing in the Legco caused the Mau Mau Rebellion. The Africans were given limited chance to representation in the parliament and mainly allowed Wambi Matu and Harry Thuku. The Legco was dominated by white settlers. This was not appreciated by the Kenyan elites and ex-servicemen. 21. The rise of Kenyan elites/nationalists caused the Mau Mau Rebellion, for example Jomo Kenyatta, Dedan Kimathi, General China among others who mobilized the Kenyan masses to rise up against colonial rule. 22. The Kenyans were opposed to disrespect of African culture and leaders. African chiefs were replaced with colonial governors and administrators. The missionaries imposed Christianity on Kenya, who opposed traditional beliefs and scorned Kenyans for being satanic, opposed the issue of female circumcision, polygamy, and the Church of Scotland and other churches were totally opposed to African cultural practices. This angered the Africans. 23. The secret Kikuyu ambition to dominate Kenya's politics led to the Mau Mau Rebellion. The Kikuyu wanted to dominate Kenya's politics at independence. This explains why the Mau Mau Rebellion began among the Kikuyu and centered in Kikuyu land. 24. Failure of peaceful means to secure Kenya's independence. 25. The role played by Kenya African National Union KANU. 26. Influence of West African nationalism, for instance the granting of Burns' constitution and the Rich's constitution to Ghana/Gold Coast and Nigeria respectively in 1946. 27. Influence of Asian nationalism/support from Jawaharlal Nehru of India. 28. Inspiration derived from the 1952 Egyptian Revolution from Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 4. British policy of favouring Asians in the commercial sector by giving them loans for business and denying those same loans to Africans. The British colonial policy of unfairly taxing Africans in Kenya by the British. The British forced labour policy applied against Africans in Kenya. Colonial policy of alienating African land in Kenya and turning it into a white settler colony. The establishment of quota system by the British. The British colonial policy of pushing Africans into reserves. Oppressive and brutal policy of the British in Kenya against the Africans. Racial segregation policies applied against the Africans by the British. The British colonial policy of divide and rule in Kenya. Disrespect of the African culture and leaders/religious conflicts. Reasons for the defeat of the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau fighters were ill-equipped in terms of weapons, for example had pangas, spears, arrows and a few rifles. Mau Mau fighters lack external bases from where to mobilize external support. Arrest and imprisonment of Mau Mau leaders, for example Kimathi, Kenyatta, General China among others. Cutting down trees in areas where Mau Mau fighters operated. Burning of bushes where the freedom fighters used to hide. Role played by white settlers in Kenya. Confinement of Africans in detention camps. Presence of African collaborators, especially chiefs. The colonial propaganda tactics worked against the Mau Mau, painted it with a tribal face. The colonial administration had a large armed force, frequently reinforced the colonial army and the King's African Rifles that comprised of fighters drawn from all British colonies. Ethnic differences within the ranks of the Mau Mau fighters, this denied them unity. The Kalenjin did not support the Mau Mau because of the Kikuyu dominance. The Mau Mau fighters lacked adequate food supplies from the peasants who were settled in the concentrated camps where they could not practice farming. Frustration among freedom fighters who resorted to giving in their firearms to the colonial forces for food. Mau Mau fighters fought in the areas which were less strategic, and it became hard for them to coordinate their activities in the forests and highlands. Lack of support from neighbouring countries like Uganda and Tanzania. Public execution of Mau Mau fighters which scared potential supporters. Effects of the Mau Mau rebellion positive. 1. It set an environment for political negotiations between the Africans and the British. They negotiated as equals. 2. The British were able to organise elections involving the native Kenyans, for example between African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 5. 4. There was removal of a ban on political activities involving the Africans. Africans were allowed to organise mass rallies. This inspired a fast move to independence. 5. Paved way for the formation of political parties in Kenya, for example KANU, CODU among others, which fastened for the respect of the rights of Kenyans. 6. Africans were able to gain access to land. This led to improvement in agricultural production. For example, between 1954 and 1959, African coffee planting increased from 4,000 to 26,000 acres. 7. Prisoners of war and others were released in order to promote justice. For example, in March 1953, the Mau Mau invaded Naivasha police station and released 173 prisoners, and a lot of arms were captured. 8. It resulted into independence of Kenya in December 1963 with Jomo Kenyatta as the supreme leader. 9. Overtaxation of the Kenyans was ended. Friendly tax collection methods were adopted. 10. It forced the British government to institute the program of constitutional change designed to prevent another costly uprising. For example, Sir Oliver Leyden, the colonial secretary, brought in 6 African elected members to the LegCo under the Leyden Constitution in 1955. Lennox Boyd Plan of 1957 increased the number to 14 in order to please the Africans. 11. Led to early independence of other British colonies, for example Ghana 1957, Tanganyika 1961, and Uganda 1962, among others. This was done in fear and panic of possible revolts elsewhere. 12. Racial inequality was ended in Kenya. The colour bar policy ended. Segregation and education provision ended, among others. 13. Kenyans were able to access employment in the civil service, replacing the whites who had dominated gainful employment in Kenya. 14. It made Jomo Kenyatta very popular following his 7 years of imprisonment allegedly for managing the Mau Mau. Kenyatta was seen as Kenya's champion and the undisputed leader who was elected to power while in prison. Negative effects. 15. Led to creation of detention camps where Africans were herded. For example, 90,000 Africans, mainly from Kikuyu land, were severely tortured. 16. A state emergency was proclaimed in Kenya on 20th October 1952 by Governor Sir Evelyn. This was monotonous for Kenyans living in the central province where most of the fighting took place. 17. Kenya-African Union was banned in 1953 on suspicions of engineering the Mau Mau uprising. 18. Several hundreds of thousands of Kikas were forcefully settled in fortified villages stretching from Nairi in the north to the Kiambu in the south. They were forced to work for the whites and movement was highly restricted. 19. Several Kenyans were arrested and imprisoned, including Jomo Kenyatta, General China, Tom Mboya, Odinga Ojinga, among others. However, their arrests and imprisonment turned them into celebrated heroes. 20. Africans turned against fellow Africans, for example, assassination of KAU moderates like Tom. African history, the Mau Mau Revolution. 6. 23. Led to several raids against colonial establishments. The freedom fighters robbed shops for firearms, carried out acts of arson, and mutilated cattle on the settler farms, which resulted into an economic crisis in Kenya. 24. Caused a decline in the level of investments in Kenya. White investors were scared and repatriated their capital in fear of economic insecurity caused by the Mau Mau revolt. 25. The war was expensive to the British and the Kenyans. About £50 million were used in suppressing the rebellion. 26. The Mau Mau rebellion was defeated by the British and made Africans lose prestige. 27. The Mau Mau leaders were publicly executed by the British troops in January 1954. General China was arrested and publicly hanged, and Dedan Kimathi in 1956 was publicly hanged. This left terrifying memories in Kenya. 28. It paralyzed the rise of national and mass political parties in Kenya. The British simply allowed the formation of regional and tribal parties to prevent the growth of serious African nationalism in Kenya. How nationalistic was the Mau Mau rebellion? Fought for restoration of Kenya's land. Fought against overtaxation of Kenyans. Fought for Kenya's independence. Fought for respect of Kenya's culture, among others. However, Mau Mau rebellion was not nationalistic as per the analysis below. The Kikuyu had a hidden agenda of dominating Kenyan politics at independence. The rebellion was confined in the Kikuyu land. It was led by the Kikuyu nationalists, for example General China, Dedan Kimathi, Kenyatta, among others. The oath of allegiance was made in the name of Kikuyu ancestors Mumbai and Gikuyu. The songs and hymns sung from oral boasting were in Kikuyu language. The Mau Mau itself was derived from the Kikuyu vocabulary. The name apparently meant go in Kikuyu. The majority of the freedom fighters were got from the Kikuyu. The Kikuyu wanted to combat cultural imperialism of the white missionaries, especially the erosion of female circumcision, which was traditionally of great importance in Kikuyu traditional life.